Next week, from G4 Biography, we step behind the Iron Curtain in search of a legend. From his humble upbringing in communist Russia to his days as a circus strongman and fire breather in the States, Jinborov Karnovsky became an international sensation.
Sure, I remember Karnov. He was eager to make his mark that one. But, hey, he was a cool guy, too round to be square. He came to me looking for a quest, worthy of his fire-breathing talents and incredible appetite for kielbasa. I suggested that he go after the famed treasure of Babylon. Well, he was gone in a flash. Poor kid. I did forget to mention about the fire-breathing dragon Ryu who guarded it. Can I get a straw for this, please?
Karnov's journey would prove more challenging than even a topless, fire-breathing, big-boned Russian with an amazing appetite for kielbasa could have expected.
Yes, I remembered when Karnov first came on the scene, Yoga Fire. I mean, what can I say? During the 80s, you could not go anywhere without seeing Karnov down to party. It was after that whole treasure of Babylon thing that he wanted to start in his own fighting game, though. He come to me for advice. He say he really enjoyed Street Fighter 2, you see. Wanted to make his own fabulous fighting franchise. Karnov's Revenge, I think he called it. Yoga Fire, Yoga Flame.
But in the end, Karnov was victorious. His victory would be bittersweet, however, as things quickly took a turn for the worse.
This battle is about to explode!
Oh man, I almost had a heart attack there. You got that killer instinct.
The battle for survival begins. Are still trying to win.
Triumph or die!
Entrust your noble soul in your sword. New opponent is ready to chase your destiny.
Can I get a round of applause for our contestants?
Fighting, don't give up. Welcome to the new stage of destiny. Karnov.
When we last left off on our tale of Karnov, we witnessed his rise to fame as the unofficial pudgy poster boy of Data East, appearing in various different games in the company's catalog. Though these varying levels of appearances did keep the strongman in the spotlight of video games, he hadn't had his own video game in quite some time, ever since his arcade release in 1987, along with the various console ports outside of it. But would fans still want to have what he offered to the masses those many years ago? Or was it perhaps time for a shift in genre for our hero? Data East's offerings in the 90s were varied to say the least. They had crude They had crude busters, or Too Crude in the US, which was their beat-em-up brawler released in arcades and later on the Genesis, even claiming to be a rival to the legendary Sega brawler Streets of Rage. Bogey Wings was a side-scrolling shooter released in 1992, set in the backdrop of World War I, where you controlled various biplanes, cars, animals, unidentifiable things against an array of mecha-wielding scientists. Nail and Scale, which was a game for the Game Boy, where the player uses only a trusty nail to navigate a labyrinth of pillars surrounded by creatures keeping him from the exit. It's a very challenging puzzler that will have you spending hours trying to figure out where the fuck you need to nail. As these games got fairly positive reviews and scores kept Data East going strong throughout the years, there was a desire to give their favorite pudgy big boy some more candy to fill his gullet. But what would they do? Well, Around this time, there was a new challenger that had been sweeping across arcades. With a smash hit featuring a genre of gaming Data East was very familiar with. The new hotness was fighting games, and the king was Street Fighter II. As previously stated, Data East did have a hand in creating one of the very first fighters with their game Karate Champ, but all that would be swept by the wayside in 1987, when a young, up-and-coming developer known as Capcom would release their game Street Fighter to arcades around the world. The game would have you playing as Ryu, a Japanese martial artist competing in an international martial arts tournament to prove his strength, which of course lied in the heart of battle. The game had you go one-on-one against AI opponents, consisting of 3 rounds, with the goal to deplete your enemy's life bar to either gain a KO or having more stamina in comparison to your opponent within 30 seconds of each round. And if you had more, you would gain the W. Whoever scored 3 wins would be the victor. And if you won, of course you would progress to your next opponent.
Brooklyn, but don't forget there are many doors for you all over the world.
The game had an 8-way joystick with 2 buttons, one for kicking and one for punching. The game would later get an update and receive a 6-button array, each of them having a specific designated type of punching kick, one for medium, one for low, and one for high. If the player performed a specific sequence of button press combinations, they could perform what is known as a special move, like the Dragon Punch and the Hurricane Kick. This game would set the groundwork for what would later emerge as one of the most popular arcade game genres in the 90s, the fighting game genre. And it all began with the game's sequel that released in 1991, Street Fighter II World Tour. The game added a new element, working off the 6-button multi-directional layout and adding a variety of playable characters to choose from, spanning from all across the globe, each having their own strengths and weaknesses, as well as their very own special moves. The game went on to be a smash hit for Capcom, and created the fighting game boom of the 90s, and fueled the fire of the genre, as well as fueling the pockets for many other developers to jump in and claim the same amount of success for themselves. The game that grossed more than $10 billion was riding high and had no signs of stopping, releasing new and improved versions to arcades as well as various home console ports. Now, at the time, this wasn't really seen as a type of game genre. It was just a game that Capcom held the intellectual property of, and owned. I think you might see where this is going. Many wanted the same piece of the pie that Capcom had so graciously served onto us, and so began the influx of what would be dubbed the Street Fighter II clones. Enter Data East. Surely, seeing the monumental success, and they themselves being no stranger to a similar type of game with their game Karate Champ 3 years before, they quickly went to work on their own interpretation of the game, and in March of 1993, not only was a baby with blue eyes birthed through a terrible snowstorm in Long Island, but a challenger to Capcom's flagship game had arrived in arcades, and that game was Fighter's History. The game, let's say it was heavily inspired by Street Fighter 2. It used a 6-button layout, just like Street Fighter 2. Medium, low, high punches and kicks designated to each button, just like Street Fighter 2. 2-player fighting with a variety of different playable characters, each with their own strengths and weaknesses and special moves, just like, okay, you get it. Not to mention that their cast of fighters consisting of blonde American martial artist, homeless vagabond with the sole goal to perfect his skills as a fighter by challenging even stronger fighters, Chinese female with kicks, and a strong, heavily muscled grappler from a foreign land. It seemed like a lot was being borrowed from Street Fighter 2. And clearly, Capcom thought the same thing, and decided to drop by Data East and slam onto their desks one nice lawsuit. The lawsuit issued by Capcom stated that Data East were infringing on their property. Now, Data East weren't strangers to a courtroom battle, nor were they strangers to a courtroom battle involving a fighting game. That's right. I think you see where this is going. In the 1980s, they clashed against Epix in the courtroom and sued them, claiming that their game, World Karate Championship, or International Karate, was a ripoff of their fighting game, that's right, that good old oldie Karate Champ. They argued that the game's name was similar, the combatants wore similar colored gi, the moves were very similar, and the scoring mechanism was just the same thing as theirs. After the clashing of legality between both parties in the case, the judge ruled that the case just be thrown out altogether, because what Data East was describing was just karate, or as he put it, the idea of karate. And, oddly enough, no one had the rights to trademark karate. And years later, the roles would seem to be reversed. And in 1994, the court trial began, as Capcom began their lawsuit against Data East. Now, this case was a big deal, as the outcome of this lawsuit would affect many other fighting games in history. Not just, ironically enough, Fighter's history. If Capcom won, they would essentially own the entire concept of fighting games, meaning that no other game could be made. If Capcom won, it wouldn't just kill Fighter's history, which would be a devastating blow to many hearts, but it would also prevent games like Mortal Kombat, King of Fighters, Clay Fighter, all fighting games as a whole, from ever being thought due to fear of legality from Capcom. Which, with a game grossing billions of dollars for them, I'm sure they have nothing but a ruthless law force at their disposal to aid in their defense. Data East would defend itself, stating that Karate Champ was the true OG of the competitive fighter, and that if anyone had the legal right to the title of fighting games, it was them, as Karate Champ came out 3 years before Street Fighter. They also stated that Fighter's history wasn't completely the same, as their game had a mechanic where each fighter had a specific weak point that varied from each fighter, and which was usually represented by a small article of clothing that when hit enough times, the opponent would enter into a dizzy animation, making them a sitting duck for punishment. And yes, Street Fighter 2 did have its own dizzying mechanic, with each fighter having a stamina bar that when dealt enough consecutive damage, it would put them in their own dizzying animation. The case raged on from both sides, claiming to be the originator of the Do Fighters. But in the end, the judge ruled that neither of them had the rights. And on October 31st of 1994, while the judge did agree that Fighter's history had some strong evidence of setting out to be a copy of Street Fighter 2, noting the biggest being the similarity of character designs and special moves, he ruled that the idea of the fighting game was commonplace and not protected by copyright. He also ruled that while the control sequence for the special moves was similar, they were not a form of expression protected by copyright. As for the representation of playable characters and special moves, the court found that 3 characters, Matlock, Phelan, and Ray, and 5 special moves in Fighter's history were similar, but not virtually identical to the characters and moves found in Street Fighter II. So in the end, Data East was able to repeat history, only this time in their favor, as well as in the favor of fighting games as a whole. Because if not for their stunning victory, many fighters you do fight today may not have had what we now all consider to be just the traditional fighter. And Fighter's history battled in the courtroom for your right to fight. Also to save their asses, but, you know, it's a W for everybody, come on. So, now that we're all aware of Fighter's history's historical impact on the fighting game genre as a whole, let's dive into Fighter's history. So, what's the game's story? The lore, if you will. 10 fighters from across the globe are invited to compete in a tournament called the Great Grapple, being hosted by the mysterious K, with the promise of fame and fortune to the victor of the Grapplethon. The promise of this fame and fortune lures our participants to come and compete for glory. Each fighter having their own ambitions driving their fists to each battle, and the one who is able to go through the gauntlet of fighters that stands between them and glory must now face their final foe. The one that had cast its shadow over the entire tournament. The one who had organized the whole shebang. The man, the myth, the legend, Karnov! Who else would be the one to have such power? Who only put on the tournament because he had nothing better to do and was utterly bored to tears. His previous adventures drowning him in various treasures and ancient powerful artifacts that made him the man that he is now, hungering for a new challenge. He puts his cavalcade of treasures on the line for whoever can best him in battle. For the only way one gains the respect of Karnov is to clash with fists, and to the victor go the spoils. Karnov's appearance went through some minor alterations. He now sports himself a fancy turban whenever he clashes with participants on the battlefield, perhaps to keep the sun out of his brow or prevent heat exhaustion during those long summer bouts, of course, as well as sporting a much more muscular physique as opposed to his much more flabbier depiction in the past, perhaps gaining some gains during his long hiatus from the center stage, with moves like fire, as he spits hot fire from his gaping jaw at his opponents, to his most iconic ability where he, while his speed and strength perfectly complement his aerial dive kicks, to using his own body as a sliding battering ram at the opponent's vulnerable knees. There's no question that taking down the Big K is no easy feat. In victory, he laughs and gloats at his pathetic foes. He reminds Ray that living by the fists dooms him to die by the very same palms that he clenches, finding Ryoko to be nothing more than a spoiled little brat, shooing away John and his flippy nonsense, having no problem with defeating Sam Chi, finding him to be nothing more than a feeble old man that just needs to be put back in his rocking chair, giving no sympathy to Lee's vengeful quest, deeming him to be nothing more than another young violent ruffian, advising Marstorius to lay off at the pasta, teaching Lei the lesson that life's short, solving another delinquency problem in the streets by tossing Matlock in the trash, and having Misoguchi being stuffed and mounted to his wall as a trophy. Jesus, that's hardcore. And lo, while you're not exactly able to play as the carnivorous Karnov by normal means in the arcade version of Fighter's history, If by some miraculous miracle one of the many competitors in the Great Grapple are able to triumph over our great big boy, here are some of the few endings of the fighters that have a decent thread to our big boy Karn. The hot-blooded American Ray, hearing of the mysterious K's strength, had left his homeland to fight and finally beat Karnov in one-on-one combat. After dealing the finishing blow to Karnov, he helped his foe off the ground, as he smiled and thanked Karnov for giving him another thrilling challenge. And without a second glance, he walked away into the distance, having no desire to strip Karnov of his fortune. For the reason he fights is for the thrill of it. And as he returned back to the US, he knew that one day, a new challenger would bring the spark of competition back into his veins. For Lee Diendo, winning the tournament is a personal matter, as years ago his father, a celebrated martial artist, was brutally beaten to death by the mysterious warrior sponsoring the Great Grapple. Now having Karnov beaten to a pulp by his own hands, he looked to deliver the final blow to avenge his father's legacy. But before he could, he was stopped. A hand from his former master reaches out, reminding him of the words of his late father. The fist raised in anger will never be the fist of a true champion. Leaving the bruised Karnov to live, he returned to his village, stripping himself of his champion title, as he trained his mind and body to regain back his throne in the name of honor. As for everyone else's endings, they really don't have a connection with Karnov, the only thread being that they defeated Karnov to achieve their own personal goals and ambitions. The only other lore to dissect from any of these endings is from Matlock's, whose prize is one of Karnov's many prized possessions that he's acquired over the years, which, for some reason, included a legendary bass guitar that when strummed could play virtually any song the player wished. I don't know where he got such an instrument. I don't know, fucking maybe El Dorado was a strummist? I don't know. And as I've stated before, you can play as Karnov in the arcade version, albeit from means that you're not supposed to be able to play with him. But as soon as you beat up, I guess yourself in this case, the game just crashes because, you know, you're not supposed to be able to play as Karnov. But hold on, gamers. Put on your tinfoil hats, because we got a little small conspiracy theory here. We're not done with Fighter's history just yet. Now, picture this. Imagine a fighter's history without Karnov. I know, the feeling just makes you sick to my stomach. I feel like I'm gonna gag just thinking about the atrocity that game would be. But according to the folks over at the cutting room floor, there is an unused sprite found in the arcade ROM featuring what appears to be a possible unused boss character. This Super Saiyan-esque warrior may or may not have been the final boss before the decision to go with Karnov. That or he would have been another boss fight for the player, as opposed to just Joker. Though, it does seem to be a decision made early in development, as there's no way to play with them and the only animations that he has are his idle poses. But we can only be thankful for the choice to go with the great and powerful Novers instead. Praise East for that. After a successful debut in arcades in 1993, Fighter's history was ported to the SNES the following year, and gained fairly positive reviews, especially stacked against the various Street Fighter II ports, in addition to another young up-and-coming fighting game's second installment, Mortal Kombat 2. The SNES port would pretty much be verbatim what you would find in the Fighter's History arcade game, with each character getting an ending, the only new addition being that you could fight the same character and there would be a color swap. And lo, there were still those that only saw a knockoff to Street Fighter II. For those that saw the diamond in the rough that was Fighter's history, they enjoyed the game. And as Reggie would say,
the game is fun.
Data East was grinning from ear to ear, overjoyed to see the praise and adulation that fans were giving their brand new fighting game. And it seemed as though Data East was not content with just one installment of their brand new fighter. Wanting to strike while the iron was hot, Data East got to work quickly on the newest installment into Fighter's history. But what could the game do? Already being cast aside by some as just being a Street Fighter II ripoff, what could another installment do to bring this fighter up to new heights? What could they include? Or rather, who could they include?
It's such a shame, but I wait for your next challenge.